She was sold for $30 and a mule. Her own father counted the coins twice, pocketed them, and told her to be grateful someone was willing to take her at all. Her mother didn't even come to the door to say goodbye. Her brothers laughed from the porch as the wagon pulled away, one of them calling out something cruel about how the scarred rancher and the ugly daughter deserved each other. Elena Harrow sat with her small bundle in her lap and her eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to let them see her cry. She didn't know it yet, but that wagon wasn't carrying her away from her life. It was carrying her toward the only one she'd ever have. Oak. If this story is already pulling at something inside you, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay with me until the very end. You won't regret it. The Harrow farm sat at the edge of nothing in particular. That was how Elena had always thought of it. Not at the edge of town, not at the edge of civilization, but at the edge of a kind of blankness that seemed to have no name. The nearest neighbor was 4 miles east down a rutted dirt road that turned to mud every spring and cracked into pale, broken earth every summer. The nearest town, Calvert's Creek, was 9 miles in the opposite direction, close enough to matter but far enough that going there always felt like an event that required justification. Elena had lived on that farm for 22 years, and in all that time, she had never once felt like she belonged to it. She rose before anyone else each morning. Not because anyone asked her to, but because the pre-dawn quiet was the only part of the day that felt genuinely hers. She'd pull on her worn dress in the dark, splash cold water on her face from the basin by the window, and go out to start the stove before her mother woke and began cataloging the previous day's failures. It was a small ritual, those few minutes of silence before the household cranked itself awake. But Elena held on to it with both hands the way a drowning person holds a piece of driftwood. She wasn't beautiful. She knew that. She'd been told it enough times that the knowledge had long since stopped being a wound and had simply become a fact, like the shape of the mountains or the direction water ran. Her nose was slightly crooked from a fall she'd taken at age 9. Her hair was a dark, unremarkable brown that refused to curl the way her mother thought it should. Her hands were roughened from work, her shoulders broad from hauling, and her eyes, a particular shade of gray-green that she privately thought was the least offensive thing about her face, were set a little too wide and a little too serious to be considered pretty by Calvert's Creek standards. Her mother had made peace with this early, or rather, she'd made a weapon of it. "No man's going to look twice at you, Elena," Martha Harrow would say, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. She said it the way a person announces rain, as observable fact, carrying no particular malice, just a flat and settled certainty about how things were. Best make yourself useful. That's something you can actually control. So Elena made herself useful. She cooked and cleaned and mended and hauled. She helped with the animals, learned to set a fence post, learned to read the sky for weather. She did the work of a farmhand and a housekeeper both. And when her brothers, Cale, who was 26 and had their father's build and their mother's temper, and Denny, who was 24 and had inherited nothing worth keeping from either parent, when they laughed at her and called her names she'd grown tired of hearing, she pressed her lips together and kept working. She didn't have many friends. The girls in town had figured out early that associating with Elena Harrow wasn't particularly advantageous, and even the kind ones had drifted away over the years, pulled toward courtships and dances, and a social world Elena was never quite invited into. She had her books, a small stack she kept under her bed, borrowed from the lending library in Calvert's Creek, and replaced every few weeks. And she had the animals, who were the most reliably decent creatures she'd ever encountered, and she had the quiet mornings before anyone else woke up. It wasn't a life, but it was what she had. The morning everything changed, Elena was in the barn. She'd been there since before sunup, working with the older milk cow who'd developed a tenderness in her left rear leg. The cow, whom Elena had unofficially named Patience despite the fact that her mother insisted farm animals shouldn't have names, was not living up to her title. She shifted and stamped and blew hot breath into the cold air, and Elena worked around her carefully, checking the swelling, pressing gently to find the source of the pain. "Easy," Elena murmured. "Easy. Nobody's going to hurt you." She heard the farmhouse door open and close, heard her father's heavy boots on the porch boards, and then the particular sound of her brothers' voices carrying across the yard. That combination of too loud and careless that meant they'd gotten into something interesting and wanted to make an announcement about it. "Elena, That was Cale. He had a voice like a thrown rock. Pa wants you inside. She finished what she was doing with patience, gave the cow's flank one last reassuring pat, and walked back across the yard. The morning was cold and bright, the kind of October morning that looked beautiful and felt like a slap. Her father, Robert Harrow, was sitting at the kitchen table with a newspaper folded open in front of him and a look on his face that she'd learned to identify over the years as the particular expression he wore when he'd had what he considered a good idea. Her mother stood at the stove with her back deliberately turned. Cale and Denny were in the doorway, and they were both wearing the same half-smile that meant they already knew something she didn't and were enjoying the imbalance. "Sit down," her father said. Elena sat. Robert Harrow set the newspaper on the table and turned it so she could see it. He tapped a section of the classified advertisements with one thick finger. Rancher named Ashcroft, out past Red Rock, looking for a wife. Elena looked at the advertisement. It was brief and businesslike. Rancher seeks wife. Capable woman preferred. No particular requirements regarding appearance. Serious inquiries only. Ask for G. Ashcroft, Red Rock Station. "All right," she said carefully. "I wrote to him," her father said. The kitchen went quiet in a specific way. The kind of quiet that comes after something has already been decided and is only now being announced. "You wrote to him," Elena said. "About what?" "About you." She looked at her father, then at her mother's back, then at her brother's identical expressions of entertained satisfaction. Something cold settled in her stomach. Not quite surprise, not quite fear, but something in between. "You told him about me. Told him you're capable, hard-working, not much to look at, but willing." Her father leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man who has solved a problem efficiently. He wrote back, "He's willing to meet. If he likes what he sees, he'll take you on." "If he takes me on," Elena said slowly. "You're 22, her mother said, still facing the stove. "You're not getting younger." "Nobody is," Elena said. "Don't be smart," Cale said. She folded her hands on the table and looked at her father. "And if I don't want to go?" Robert Harrow's expression shifted slightly. Not to anger exactly, but to a kind of patient immovability. "You got better options here. Because I'll tell you plainly, Elena, I can't afford to keep feeding a grown woman who's not pulling her weight. I do all the weight, when I've got 2 boys here who could use the extra room and the extra income." He picked up the newspaper, folded it shut with the comfortable finality of someone closing a subject. "Ashcroft's sending a wagon Friday. You'll be on it." She found out about the money 2 days later. It wasn't something she was supposed to find out. She overheard it, her father and Cale talking in the barn on Thursday evening, their voices carrying through the thin plank walls, with the particular clarity that thin plank walls sometimes have for conversations people don't want overheard. $30, her father was saying, and he's throwing in one of his work mules. "That's fair," Cale said. "Better than fair, considering. A man wants a worker, not a wife. He knows what he's getting. Does he know what she's getting?" A pause. Then her father, in a voice that was almost amused. "He's got a face that'd stop a clock, from what I hear. Burned, or something. Got in a fire years back." A short, dry sound that might have been a laugh. "Seems right." Elena stood in the yard with her hands at her sides, and the cold coming up through the soles of her boots, and she listened to her father sell her for the price of a mule. Then she went inside. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark room she'd slept in her whole life. The small back room with the window that faced the empty field and the single quilt her grandmother had made that she'd kept, because no one else wanted it. And she sat there for a long time without lighting the lamp. She wasn't going to cry. She'd decided that firmly, and she was going to stick to it. What she was going to do, what she was doing, sitting in the dark with her hands flat on her thighs, was decide something. She'd spent 22 years letting things happen to her, letting the household flow around her and over her like water around a stone. She'd endured and adapted and made herself useful and told herself that patience was a kind of strength. Maybe it was, but it hadn't gotten her anywhere. She pulled her small trunk out from under the bed and began, methodically and quietly, to pack. The wagon came on Friday as promised. It wasn't much. An older farm wagon, well kept but plain, driven by a man named Horace, who appeared to be somewhere in his 60s and communicated primarily in grunts. He had a gray beard and suspicious eyes, and he looked Elena over when she came out of the house with her trunk, the way a man looks at cargo he's been asked to transport without having been given enough information about its nature. Her family did not make a ceremony of the departure. Her mother stood on the porch with her arms crossed, and for a moment, just a moment, Elena thought she saw something move across her mother's face, some flicker of something that might have been regret or tenderness or the shadow of either. Then Martha Harrow said, "Right when you get there," in a flat voice, and the moment, if it had existed at all, was gone. Her father shook her hand. He actually shook her hand, like she was a business associate concluding a transaction, which she supposed was roughly accurate. Cale called out something from the porch that she chose not to hear clearly. Denny, to his minor credit, said nothing at all, just watched from the yard with his hands in his pockets, and an expression that she couldn't read and didn't particularly want to. Horace loaded her trunk and handed her up onto the wagon bench with practiced efficiency. Elena settled herself, set her small bag on her lap, and looked straight ahead down the dirt road. "Ready?" Horace asked. "Yes," she said. The wagon rolled. She did not look back. She almost made it, too. Almost got the wagon around the bend and out of sight of the farmhouse with her composure entirely intact. Then the familiar shape of the oak tree at the edge of the property came into view. The oak tree she'd climbed as a child and read under as a teenager, and that had been, in a way she'd never told anyone, the closest thing she'd had to a private place. And something shifted in her chest, sudden and painful. She pressed her lips together hard and kept her eyes on the road. "You have nothing to go back to," she told herself. "You're going somewhere. You don't know what it is yet, but it is somewhere, which is more than you had yesterday." It wasn't exactly a comforting thought, but it was a true one, and Elena had always found truth steadier underfoot than comfort. The journey to Red Rock took the better part of 2 days. They stopped the first night at a small inn along the route. Horace paid for it without being asked, which was the first mildly surprising thing that had happened and which Elena noted carefully. It wasn't kindness exactly, more like the man had a set of practical protocols and a woman traveling alone fell under a specific category that required a roof. But he also brought her a bowl of stew without commenting on its contents, and answered her questions about the territory in short but genuinely informative sentences. And by the end of the first evening, Elena had decided he was, if not warm, at least decent. "What's he like?" she asked that evening when they were sitting at the small table near the inn's single fireplace. "Ashcroft." Horace turned his bowl in his hands. "Quiet." "That's not much of a description." "It's accurate." "Does he—" She chose her words carefully. "Is he—" "He won't hurt you," Horace said, flatly and without elaboration, as though he'd understood what she was actually asking and had decided to skip the circumlocution. "He's a hard man in some ways, but not that kind of hard." Elena nodded. She thought about asking about the burns, about what her father had said, the face that would stop a clock, but she found that she didn't particularly want to. It seemed like information that would arrive on its own terms when it arrived. "He was in a fire," she said. "That's what I heard." Horace looked at her steadily. "Yes." "What happened?" "Not my story to tell?" She nodded again. "Fair enough." They finished their supper in silence, and Elena went to bed in a small upstairs room with a single window and a lumpy mattress, and stared at the ceiling for a while before sleep finally came. The second day's drive brought the landscape gradually out of the flat scrubland she'd grown up with, and into something rougher and more dramatic. Low hills that grew into proper rises, the soil shifting redder, the vegetation scrubber, and more determined looking. Red Rock, she understood now, had gotten its name honestly. Everything here had an edge to it, a quality of having survived something. She found herself liking it. They came over a rise in the middle of the afternoon, and Horace pulled the horses to a momentary stop. "Ashcroft land starts here," he said. He nodded at the valley below. The ranch spread across the valley floor like something that had grown rather than been built. A main house of dark timber with a wide porch, several outbuildings in various states of age and repair, a large barn that looked newer than the rest of it, and fenced pastures stretching back toward the tree-lined creek that ran along the eastern edge. There were horses in the far pasture, maybe a dozen of them, moving slowly in the afternoon light. It was not a beautiful place, but it was substantial, real. "It's bigger than I expected," Elena said. "Man works hard," Horace said and shook the reins. Gideon Ashcroft was on the porch when the wagon came down the drive. Elena saw him from a distance first, a tall figure, broad through the shoulders, standing very still with his thumbs hooked in his belt. As the wagon got closer, she could make out more. Dark work pants, worn boots, a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the autumn chill. Dark hair, somewhat overgrown. And then, as they pulled to a stop in front of the house, the left side of his face. The burn scars ran from just below his ear down across his jaw and onto his neck, pulling the skin tight and giving that side of his face a kind of stretched, mask-like quality. They were old scars, pale and silver, not the angry red of recent injury, but they were extensive, and they were the first thing you saw. There was no pretending otherwise. Elena did not look away. She also did not make the face people sometimes made, the small, involuntary wince, the too quick look elsewhere. She just looked, the way she'd look at any person she was meeting for the first time, with the particular steady attention she'd developed over years of being the kind of person other people talked over. Gideon Ashcroft looked back at her with dark eyes that were difficult to read. Horace climbed down from the wagon with the slow dignity of a man who had earned the right to move at his own pace and went around to begin unloading Elena's trunk. Elena stayed where she was for a moment, then climbed down herself before anyone could think to help her. A reflex, after years of managing her own getting in and out of things. She walked toward the porch. He came down the steps to meet her, which surprised her somehow, as though she'd expected him to remain elevated. "Miss Harrow," he said. His voice was deeper than she'd expected and careful in a way that wasn't quite formal but wasn't quite casual either, like a man who chose his words with some thought before deploying them. "Mr. Ashcroft," she said. They looked at each other for a moment in the particular way of two strangers who have agreed to examine the possibility of a shared future and are now doing the initial examination. "Long drive?" he asked. "2 days," she said. "It's a good road, though. Better than what I'm used to." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one, like the shadow a smile would cast. "Come in. Margaret's got coffee." Margaret Ashcroft was Gideon's younger sister, and she was the single clear surprise of Elena's first afternoon at the ranch, where Elena had expected what? Reserve, probably. Suspicion, maybe? The particular wariness of a household that had gotten used to being just the two of them, and was now having its arrangements altered. Instead, she got Margaret, who was 28 and compact and restlessly energetic, and who came out of the kitchen the moment they came through the door, with an expression of such undisguised relief that Elena nearly stopped walking. "Oh, thank goodness," Margaret said, looking Elena over in a rapid, comprehensive way that managed to be assessing without being unkind. "Someone who looks like she actually knows what work is." "Margaret," Gideon said, in a tone that suggested this was not the opening he'd planned. "What?" "It's a compliment." Margaret stuck out her hand to Elena. "Margaret Ashcroft, I've been running this house for 4 years and I'm tired. No offense to my brother, but he's not much use in a kitchen." "I'm useful in a kitchen," Gideon said. "You burned the cornbread twice last month." "Once was the stove's fault. The stove tells a different story." Margaret turned back to Elena with the brisk warmth of someone who'd decided to like her and was already moving past the formalities. "Come sit down. You must be exhausted. Coffee?" Elena sat at the kitchen table, a big, solid table, scarred from years of use, the kind of table that had absorbed a great many meals and conversations and ordinary mornings, and accepted the coffee and looked around the kitchen while Margaret moved efficiently between the stove and the counter, and Gideon stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and watched his sister take over the situation he'd presumably been prepared to manage himself. The kitchen was not particularly orderly. There were tools on the counter that belonged in the barn, a stack of mending on the chair in the corner, a list of something tacked to the wall near the door, with items crossed off in a decisive hand. It had the comfortable disorder of a place that was actually lived in, actually used, by people who had more important things to do than keep it perfect. Elena liked it immediately. "Your room's upstairs," Gideon said from the doorway. "Second door. It's plain, but it's yours." "That's fine," Elena said. "Plain is fine." He nodded, and something in the set of his shoulders shifted very slightly, as though she'd passed some kind of small test. "I'll show you the property tomorrow," he said. "If you want." "I'd like that." He nodded again. Then he said, with the care of someone who has decided something matters enough to say it clearly, "Miss Harrow, I want you to know that whatever arrangement brought you here, that's your business and mine and nobody else's. Far as I'm concerned, you're here of your own accord. If at any point you decide this isn't—" He paused. "If you want to leave, you can leave. There won't be any fuss about it." Elena set down her coffee cup. In 22 years, it was the first time anyone in her family, and she supposed he wasn't her family, not yet, maybe not ever, but he was the first person in the position her family occupied, had told her that leaving was something she was allowed to do. "Thank you," she said. He gave a short nod and disappeared back through the door, and Margaret, who had been listening with the practiced non-expression of someone pretending not to listen, refilled Elena's cup without being asked. The room was, as promised, plain, but it was hers. That was the part that kept striking her that first night, the particular quality of solitude that comes from being in a room where no one is going to come in without knocking, where no one's resentments are seeping under the door, where the air carries no weight of someone else's disappointment. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, a proper bed, bigger than the one at the farm, with a decent mattress and a quilt that smelled of cedar and clean air, and listened to the sounds of the ranch at night. Different from the farm sounds she knew, the horses were farther away. There was a creak she could hear faintly, a low, liquid sound she found unexpectedly comforting, an owl somewhere in the trees, wind against the window glass. She'd eaten supper with Gideon and Margaret, a simple meal, beans and bread and dried apple pie that Margaret had made that morning, eaten at that big scarred table with the oil lamp between them. The conversation had been careful, but not strained. Margaret asked questions, practical ones about what Elena knew and what she'd done, and Elena answered honestly, and Gideon mostly listened, and once or twice she'd looked up from her plate and found him watching her with that unreadable expression. And when their eyes met, he'd looked away without embarrassment, as though looking at her was simply something he was doing and being caught at it wasn't a problem. She'd thought about that going up the stairs. She lay back on the bed with her hands on her stomach and stared at the dark ceiling. "Don't do anything foolish," she told herself. "You have been here for 6 hours. You don't know this man. You don't know what this is. Keep your head." It was good advice. She intended to take it. She fell asleep faster than she had in years. Morning came cold and clear, the sun coming through the window at an angle that turned the plain wooden floor golden, and Elena was up before it had fully risen, dressed and downstairs before anyone else stirred, standing in the kitchen trying to remember where everything was from the brief orientation she'd gotten the night before. She found the coffee. She found the stove's particular temperament. It ran hot on the left side and needed coaxing on the right. In about 10 minutes of careful attention. She found the bread from the day before and the eggs and the small supply of salt pork and began to think about breakfast. She'd been at it for maybe 20 minutes when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Not the heavier tread she associated with Gideon, but a lighter, quicker step that resolved into Margaret appearing in the kitchen doorway in her robe, with her hair still loose and an expression of blank surprise. "You're up," Margaret said. "Habit," Elena said. Margaret looked at the stove, looked at the coffee, looked at the eggs already beaten in the bowl. "How long have you been awake?" "Since before light." Margaret came to the table and sat down in one of the chairs and put her chin in her hand and regarded Elena with an expression that was somewhere between appreciation and guilt. "I usually make breakfast," she said. "I can do it. I don't mind." "That's not—" Margaret stopped, started again. "You don't have to prove yourself right out of the gate." "I'm not proving anything," Elena said, which was honest. "I just woke up and I was hungry, and making food for one person when you could just as easily make it for 3 always seemed inefficient." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Our last housekeeper," she said carefully, "lasted about 3 months. She cried a lot." "I don't cry much." "Is that by nature or necessity?" Elena considered this while she turned the salt pork in the pan. "Probably both, by now." Margaret made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the vicinity of one. "I think," she said, "that you might actually be all right." Gideon showed her this property after breakfast, as he'd promised. He was different outside than he'd been in the house, less contained somehow, more comfortable, the way some people are when they have ground under their feet and sky overhead and the particular freedom of practical movement. He walked the fence lines with a proprietorial ease that was not arrogance but familiarity, the movement of a man in his own territory, and he talked about the ranch in a way he hadn't talked about anything yet, directly, specifically, with something that came close to enthusiasm underneath the careful surface. "I've had this land 8 years," he told her. They were walking along the eastern pasture fence, the creek visible in the trees below, the horses moving in the far field. "Came out here after—" He paused. A small pause, the kind that contains a whole clause someone's decided to omit. "After I needed somewhere new, bought the main parcel from a man who was giving up on it, built the barn the second year." "It's solid work," Elena said, looking at the fence posts. Someone had taken care with them. They were set deep and true. "I do things once, and I do them right," he said. "It takes longer, but then you don't have to do them again." "That's efficient." He glanced at her sideways. "My sister says I'm stubborn." "Those aren't mutually exclusive," Elena said. This time there was something that was unmistakably, if briefly, a smile. It appeared on the unburned side of his face and was gone quickly, but it was there, and she filed it away. They came around to the barn, and he showed her the horses with the particular care of a man who has strong feelings about horses and has learned that not everyone shares them. He introduced them by name, all 12 of them, their histories, their personalities, their specific quirks and requirements, and Elena listened and asked questions, and somewhere in the middle of his explanation of why a gray gelding named Courthouse had to be handled from the left or not at all, she realized that this man was not the grim, closed-off figure her father's description had suggested. He was a private man. There was a difference. "You know horses," he said, when she correctly anticipated Courthouse's reaction to a particular movement and stepped back before he could tell her to. "I grew up with them. My father's farm had a few." She thought about Patience, back in that cold barn, with her swollen leg. Hoped whoever was tending her now, probably no one, was the honest answer, was at least noticing the problem. "I like them better than most of the people." Gideon looked at her with that steady, dark gaze. "Yeah," he said. "I know what you mean." The first week unfolded in the particular way of practical arrangements being tested against reality. Elena learned the ranch's rhythms. When Gideon rose, before she did, which she found mildly challenging, though she adjusted, what the morning chores required, how the household ran and where it didn't run quite as well as it should. She took stock with the methodical attention she'd developed over 22 years of managing other people's lives, and she did it quietly, without announcement, making small adjustments where she could, and noting larger problems for later consideration. Margaret watched all of this with an expression that oscillated between gratitude and something more complicated. A kind of wary hope, Elena thought, the particular wariness of someone who had been managing alone for long enough to be suspicious of help. On the third day, while they were hanging laundry, Margaret said abruptly, "You don't have to do all of this, you know." "I know," Elena said. "I mean it. You're not here to be a servant." "I know that too." Then, "Margaret." Elena turned to look at her directly. "I worked that farm from the time I was old enough to hold a bucket. I did it because I had to, and nobody thanked me for it, and I'm not looking for thanks now either. I'm doing this because I'm here, and it needs doing, and I don't know how to not work. That's all." She went back to the laundry. "If I'm doing something wrong or something you'd rather handle yourself, tell me. I won't take it personally." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Our mother used to hang the sheets on the inside lines first," she said, "the ones that catch the most sun." "That's smarter," Elena said, and moved the sheets. Something shifted between them that afternoon, quiet and practical, the way real things tend to shift. She had her first real conversation with Gideon on the 6th day in the evening. Margaret had gone to bed early. "A headache," she said, rubbing her temples with the expression of a woman who'd been having this particular headache for some years and had made a provisional peace with its recurring visits. And Elena had stayed up mending by the fire, and Gideon had come in from the barn with his jacket dusty and his hands cold and sat down in the chair across from her with a cup of coffee, and the particular quality of stillness that she was starting to recognize as his default state. They sat in silence for a while, which was comfortable in a way she hadn't expected. Your family, he said eventually. They treated you all right? She kept her eyes on the mending. Why do you ask? Because you flinch sometimes, when someone raises their voice, even over ordinary things. A pause. I notice things. It's probably annoying. It's not annoying, she said. And because Horace mentioned that the arrangement your father proposed was... He stopped. I don't need the details. I want you to know that whatever that was, it's not what I'm... He stopped again, as though the sentence had gotten somewhere he hadn't intended. This is your home, if you want it to be. I don't have expectations that you... Mr. Ashcroft, Elena said. Gideon. Gideon! She looked up from the mending. He was watching her with that careful attention, and the fire was doing interesting things to the scarred side of his face, turning the silver-pale skin amber. I understand what you're trying to say, and I appreciate it, but you don't have to tiptoe around me. I'm not tiptoeing, he said, with a faint trace of something that might have been indignation. I'm being considerate. There's a difference. Fair enough, she said. And then, because it seemed important to say, my family was not particularly kind to me. That's the short version. I'm not fragile because of it. I'm just cautious, and probably slow to trust things that look good, because things that looked good turned out to be traps more often than not. He nodded. He seemed to understand this without requiring elaboration. That's sensible, he said. It doesn't feel sensible, she said honestly. It feels like being tired. They sat in silence for another while. The fire popped and settled. The fire, she said without quite meaning to say it aloud. Was that here? On the ranch? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, No, before I came here, He turned the coffee cup in his hands. I had a different life before this one. There was a fire. I got out. Some people didn't. A pause. That's the short version. Fair enough, she said. They sat with that between them, their respective short versions, their respective things that didn't need to be explained yet. And the fire burned lower, and neither of them moved to go to bed. It was, Elena thought later, the most honest conversation she'd had with another person in longer than she could easily remember. 3 weeks in, there was the storm. It came down from the north on a Wednesday afternoon, moving faster than Gideon had predicted when he'd looked at the sky that morning and said there was weather coming. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and the clouds had gone the specific dark green that meant serious business, and Gideon had gone out to secure things and gotten most of the animals in before the first real gusts hit. Elena was in the kitchen when she heard it, not the wind, which had been building for an hour, but something underneath it. A sound from the barn, a sound that resolved, as she listened, into a horse in genuine distress. She grabbed her coat from the hook and went out into it. The wind hit her like a wall, not just blowing but pushing, the kind of wind that has intention behind it. She kept her head down and crossed the yard to the barn, pulled the door open against the resistance of the air, and got inside. The barn was all movement and noise. The animals that were in their stalls had gone tense and restless, ears back, shifting in the way of creatures that know something's wrong but can't outrun it. At the far end, in the largest stall, a young roan mare named Cinder, one of the horses Gideon had told her was high-strung, needed careful handling, spooked easily in bad weather, was in full panic. She wasn't a large horse. She was fast and fine-boned, and under normal circumstances she was beautiful, but right now she was throwing herself against the stall boards with a wild-eyed terror that was going to get her hurt. Okay, Elena said to herself as much as the horse. Okay. She didn't think about it very hard. She'd worked with frightened animals her whole life, and the thinking part of it had long since moved somewhere below conscious consideration. She spoke as she moved, low, continuous sound. Not words exactly, but something with the rhythm of words. And she went to the grain bin and got a small handful of oats and held it out as she approached the stall door. Cinder reared. Elena stepped back, kept her voice even. Hey now, I hear you. It's loud and it's scary, and there's nothing wrong with that, but I need you to come down now. The mare came down, shaking. She was trembling so hard Elena could see it from 3 feet away. Yeah, Elena said. Yeah, I know. She opened the stall door. This was the part that was either going to work or it wasn't. She stepped in with the horse, which was either brave or stupid, and she'd decided years ago she didn't spend much time distinguishing between the two when an animal needed her, and she let Cinder push her nose against her chest and blow hot, frightened breath against her coat, and she stood there with one hand on the mare's neck and talked to her while the storm beat itself against the barn walls. She was still in the stall when Gideon came in. She heard the barn door and his voice calling her name over the wind, heard his boots on the floor, and then he was at the stall door looking in at her with an expression she couldn't entirely parse in the dim light. "How long have you been in here?" he said. "I don't know, 20 minutes?" "You walked out in that—" She was panicking, Elena said simply. Gideon looked at Cinder, who had her nose on Elena's shoulder and was breathing somewhat less like a creature about to come apart. He looked at Elena. He looked at Cinder again. "She doesn't let anyone but me in that stall during a storm," he said. Elena looked down at the mare. "Well," she said, "maybe she was making an exception." The storm hammered the barn. A board somewhere creaked in a way that made all the animals tense. Elena put her hand back on Cinder's neck without thinking, and the mare pressed into it. And Gideon stood at the stall door for a long moment watching the two of them. And his expression, when she looked up at him, was not the careful, unreadable look he usually wore. It was something else, something she didn't have a name for yet. "Come in or close the door," she said. "You're letting the cold in." He came in. The storm lasted 4 hours and took out 2 fence sections and the roof of the older storage shed. Nobody was hurt. Cinder came through it nervous but intact. They didn't talk about it directly afterward, the way they didn't talk directly about most things. But something had changed in the barn during those 4 hours, with the storm shaking the walls and Elena standing with a frightened horse, and Gideon close enough that she could have reached out and touched him, and whatever it was, it didn't unchange after the weather cleared. She was aware of him differently after that, not uncomfortably. There was nothing alarming about it, nothing that raised the old familiar wariness. But she was aware of him. The way he moved, the careful way he spoke, the moments when the careful quality slipped and something warmer showed through underneath. The way he brought coffee to the barn without being asked when she was working late. The way he looked at her sometimes across the supper table when he thought she wasn't noticing. She was noticing. "Don't do anything foolish," she reminded herself with somewhat less conviction than she'd managed 3 weeks ago. "You're not going to be here forever. You don't know what this is yet. Keep your head." Her head, however, was beginning to formulate opinions of its own. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by the mail rider who came through Red Rock every 2 weeks. Elena was in the kitchen when Gideon brought it in, and she knew from the way he held it, not quite giving it to her, just setting it on the table, that it wasn't good news. She looked at the handwriting on the envelope. Her father's hand. Blocky and deliberate, the writing of a man who'd learned it as a tool rather than an art. She picked it up, set it back down, picked it up again. "Elena," it said inside, "word has come back to us that you've made yourself comfortable out there. Your brothers and I will be coming to see the situation for ourselves and bring you home if we decide it's needed. We are your family, and that counts for something, whatever you might think. We expect to arrive around the end of November. Your mother sends her regards. She read it twice. Then she folded it precisely along its original creases and set it on the table." Gideon was still there. He'd seen her face. "Your father?" he said. "My brothers are with him," she said. Her voice was even. She was working on keeping it even. "They're coming here. At the end of November, that's..." She counted. 3 weeks. Gideon was quiet. She could see him thinking, that particular inward stillness that meant he was considering something carefully before he spoke. "They can't make you go anywhere," he said finally. "I know that." "Do you?" She looked at him. "I know it," she said. "I'm still..." She stopped. "It's different knowing it and not feeling it pull." He nodded. He seemed to understand this distinction without her having to explain it. "They show up here, they show up on my land," he said. "That changes some of what they're able to do. I don't want to cause trouble for you." "Elena." He said her name. Her given name, which he hadn't used often, which carried a weight she felt across the table. "They're the ones coming here looking for trouble. That's not yours." She looked down at the letter folded neatly on the table, at her father's handwriting, at the words "bring you home," as though there had ever been a home to be brought to. "They sold me," she said quietly. It was the first time she'd said it aloud to anyone. "My father and my brothers, they took money for sending me here. $30. A pause. "And a mule." Gideon was very still. "That's why I left without any fight," she said, "because by the time I found out what they'd done, I'd already decided it was the right choice. But I should know. You should know the kind of people you're dealing with." He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Not anger exactly, but something underneath anger, something colder and more permanent. "I knew the kind of people I was dealing with," he said, "when you climbed down off that wagon." She looked at him. "The way you held yourself," he said, "like you were expecting someone to find something wrong with you." She didn't say anything. 3 weeks, he said. "That's time to get ready. Bye." Elena lay awake that night for a long time, not with fear exactly, or not only fear. What she felt was something more complicated, a kind of bracing, the internal adjustment of someone preparing for a blow they've been waiting for their whole life. She'd always known this wasn't over. You didn't escape her family by getting on a wagon. You didn't escape them by getting further away than 9 miles. They'd come eventually, because they'd always come eventually, always found a new way to reassert the idea that she belonged to them. What was different, lying in this room with its cedar-smelling quilt and its window that looked out at the dark sky over Ashcroft Land, was that this time she was going to be standing in a different place when they arrived, and she was not going to be standing there alone. She turned onto her side and looked at the dark window for a while. Outside, the creek was doing its low, liquid thing in the dark, and somewhere in the barn, Cinder was sleeping off whatever horses dream about, and the land that had belonged to Gideon Ashcroft for 8 years was sitting under the stars being quietly, permanently itself. Elena closed her eyes. 3 weeks, she thought. All right, 3 weeks. She slept. The 3 weeks did not pass quietly. That was the thing about waiting for something bad. It had a way of coloring everything around it, of making ordinary mornings feel provisional, of turning the small good things into things you held a little tighter because you knew they had a deadline on them. Elena went about the ranch work with the same deliberate attention she'd brought to everything since she arrived, but underneath it, like a stone in a boot you learned to walk around, was the knowledge that her father's letter was sitting in the kitchen drawer, and November was getting shorter. Margaret knew about the letter. Gideon had told her, which Elena had expected and didn't resent. Margaret's reaction had been swift and predictable. Her chin had come up and her eyes had gone flat in the particular way of a woman who has managed a household alone for 4 years and has developed strong opinions about people who arrive uninvited and expect to take things away. "They're not welcome here," Margaret had said, which was generous in its simplicity. "They might come anyway," Elena told her. "Then they'll find out what unwelcome looks like up close." Elena had almost smiled at that. She was learning that Margaret's warmth and Margaret's temper ran from the same source, a kind of fierce, practical love that didn't distinguish much between the people she cared about and the things she was willing to do for them. It was a quality Elena hadn't encountered much in her life, and she was still a little uncertain what to do with it. What she did was work. The days had their rhythm now, a rhythm she'd settled into with the ease of someone who had spent her whole life adapting to the rhythms of other households. She rose early, started the stove, made coffee. The morning chores, the animals, the feeding, the checking of the fence lines after the last storm had taken 2 sections down. Breakfast at the big table, the 3 of them, conversations that were still careful but had stopped being awkward, had settled into something more like 2 people learning how to talk to each other without the benefit of having known each other before. Gideon spoke more than she'd initially expected. Not more than Margaret. No one spoke more than Margaret, but more than the closed, contained figure she'd assembled from a newspaper advertisement and Horace's grunts. He had opinions about things. About the land. About horses. About the way the territory was changing as more settlers pushed west and the open range started having edges. He said these things in the careful, measured way he said everything, like a man who has learned to be deliberate about what he lets out. But once he started, he didn't stop easily, and Elena found herself listening not just to be polite, but because she was genuinely interested, which surprised her in the pleasant way that genuine interest usually does. One afternoon, about 10 days after the letter arrived, they were repairing the fence section that the storm had taken out, and Gideon was working a fence post back into ground that had gone hard with the coming cold. And he said without preamble, "You're not sleeping." Elena didn't deny it. There wasn't much point. She'd caught herself at the breakfast table twice now, with a particular hollowness around the eyes that poor sleep leaves. And Gideon noticed things, as he'd told her himself. It was probably annoying. "I sleep some," she said. He drove the post deeper with 2 solid hits of the mallet. "You want to talk about it, or you want me to pretend I didn't notice?" She thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet." Fair enough. They worked in silence for a while. The cold had gotten real now, the kind of cold that meant business, that made your breath visible and numbed your fingers inside the gloves if you stopped moving. Elena stretched the wire while Gideon set the next post, and somewhere in the practical rhythm of the work, the knot in her chest loosened, just slightly. "I'm not afraid of them," she said. Gideon let that sit for a moment. "No, not the way I used to be." She paused, searching for the right words. "When I was young, I was afraid the way you're afraid of something you can't see the edges of. My father's anger, my brother's, it just seemed like it went on forever, no walls to it. I never knew how far it reached." She pulled the wire taut and held it. "But I've been here long enough now to start seeing the edges. And they're smaller than I thought." She said it quietly, like something she was still deciding whether to believe. "They're just men, mean and small-minded, and they don't like to be crossed. But they're just men." Gideon secured the wire without looking at her. "They're still coming." "I know." Knowing they're small doesn't necessarily make the confrontation easier. "No," she agreed. "It just means I can see where it ends." He did look at her then, over the fence line, and his expression had that quality she'd come to recognize. Something being weighed, something decided. "You don't have to handle it alone," he said, "whatever they come here saying. You don't have to stand there by yourself and take it." Elena looked at him for a moment. This man with his scarred face and his careful voice and his piece of land out past Red Rock that he'd built into something real with 8 years of deliberate, patient work. "I know," she said. And this time she meant it differently than she had before. Not as a polite acknowledgement, but as something she actually believed. The post was solid. They moved on to the next section. The rumor reached them the following week, carried into town by the kind of conversation that moves faster than any wagon. Elena heard it first from the wife of the feed store owner, a stout and well-intentioned woman named Mrs. Calloway, who managed to convey the maximum amount of information in any given exchange while maintaining a surface of complete innocence about the fact that she was conveying it. Elena had gone into Red Rock for supplies, a trip she was still getting used to, the small-town rhythms of a place that was and wasn't like Calvert's Creek. And Mrs. Calloway had found her at the dry goods counter with the efficiency of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this moment. "I hear you've settled in nicely out at the Ashcroft place," Mrs. Calloway said, in a voice that was entirely too pleasant. "I have," Elena said. "Gideon's a good man." A brief pause that carried considerable weight. "People weren't sure at first when he came out here." Her eyes went to some middle distance, performatively thoughtful. "With his situation, people talk." "People do," Elena agreed, not volunteering anything. "Of course, they talk about you too now." The pleasant voice acquired a faint edge of something that wasn't quite apology. "Word travels about your family, how they came to send you out here." Elena set down the bolt of cloth she'd been examining. She turned to look at Mrs. Calloway directly with the steady gray-green gaze that people sometimes found unsettling because it didn't look away when they expected it to. "What are people saying?" she asked. To her credit, Mrs. Calloway met her eyes. "That you were sent away because your family didn't want you. That the arrangement was not the usual kind." A pause. "Some people think it's a sad story. And some people think it's something else?" A slight discomfort crossed the other woman's face. "You know how people are, dear." Elena did know how people were. She'd known her whole life. She picked the cloth back up, measured what she needed, and set it on the counter. "Thank you for telling me," she said, which was sincere, because she'd rather know than not know, even when the knowing was unpleasant. She drove back to the ranch with the supplies in the wagon and the information sitting in her chest like something she hadn't finished digesting. The thing about rumors was that they had their own kind of weight, separate from the truth they may or may not carry. She'd spent her life being the subject of a particular kind of story, the unwanted one, the plain one, the girl nobody chose. And she'd learned that the story had a life of its own, moved through social spaces like water through cracks, and she'd never found an effective way to stop it. You could contradict it, but contradiction only gave it more air. What you could do, she'd discovered over long and unpleasant experience, was be so clearly yourself, so plainly and stubbornly present, that the story had nowhere to attach. She hadn't always managed it, but she was getting better. When she got back to the ranch, Margaret was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the look of someone who had recently had an argument and was processing it. Elena unloaded the supplies and then sat down across from her without asking whether she wanted company. "What happened?" she said. Margaret wrapped both hands around her cup. "Clara Heston came by while you were gone." A pause. She considers herself a friend of the family, of my family specifically. She had some things to say. About me. About how you came to be here." Margaret's jaw was set in a way Elena had come to associate with something she was working hard to say carefully. She called it charity. The word landed between them and sat there. "What did you say?" Elena asked. "I told her that if she was so interested in charity, she could start by offering some to people who actually needed it, and then I showed her the door." Margaret looked up, which was probably not the most diplomatic. "It was the right response," Elena said. "People are going to keep saying things." "People are going to keep saying things," Elena agreed. "That's just what they do. It's not—" She stopped, then started again, finding the honest version of it. "It used to bother me more. People talking, deciding who I was before they'd looked at me. But I've spent my whole life trying to be enough for people who'd already decided I wasn't, and it's a small, tired exhale. It's exhausting, and it doesn't work." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Does it bother you, what they're saying about how you got here, the money?" Elena considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things, fully, without flinching away from the part that hurt. "It bothers me," she said honestly, "that my father thought so little of me that he put a price on it. What people make of it—" She shrugged. "I can't control what people make of it. You're calmer about it than I would be. I've had more practice." Margaret looked at her with an expression that was more complicated than sympathy, something closer to the recognition of a thing that shouldn't have had to be practiced. She didn't say anything else about it, just got up and poured Elena a cup of tea and set it down without ceremony, and Elena accepted it the same way. The letter had said the end of November. The end of November arrived the way unwanted things do, too soon and also, in some other way, somehow not soon enough, because the waiting had gotten its own particular weight, and she was tired of carrying it. She was splitting wood behind the barn when she heard the horses. She heard them before she saw them. The particular sound of horses being ridden at a deliberate pace, not fast but with intention. She set the axe down without putting it away. She straightened. She was aware of her heart doing something loud in her chest, and she breathed through it, measured and slow. The way she'd breathed through frightened animals in the barn. Just men, she told herself. Just mean, small-minded men. She walked around the side of the barn and stood at the corner where she could see the drive. There were 3 of them. Her father on a dark horse she didn't recognize, sitting the way he always sat a horse. 2 upright, like a man performing the idea of riding rather than actually doing it. Cale on his left, broader than she remembered somehow, or maybe she was just seeing him differently now. And Denny on the right, with his hands in his pockets and his particular expression of someone who would rather be anywhere else but doesn't know how to say so. They pulled up in front of the house. Her father looked around the property with the assessing eye of a man who has come to determine whether an investment is performing as expected. His gaze moved over the main house, the barn, the fencing, the pastures, with a methodical attention that made Elena's stomach tighten in a way she refused to call fear. Gideon came out of the house. He came down the porch steps with the same proprietary ease she had noticed that first day. A man on his own ground, not hostile but not accommodating either, with the particular stillness of someone who has decided in advance exactly where he stands and is not moving. Harrow, he said. Not a greeting. An acknowledgement. Her father looked at him with the careful expression of a man assessing an obstacle. His gaze moved over Gideon's scarred face, in the way people's gazes moved over it. That involuntary calculation, that rapid social adjustment. And then he pulled it back into something more controlled. Ashcroft, he said. We've come to see our daughter. Elena walked out from the side of the barn. She had not planned this exactly. She hadn't known when they would arrive, hadn't staged her entrance. She was in her work clothes, her hair coming loose from its braid, her hands roughened from the wood splitting. She looked like what she was, a woman who had been working. She looked nothing like the girl who had climbed into a wagon 6 weeks ago with a small bundle in her lap and her eyes fixed straight ahead. She wasn't sure they noticed the difference yet. Father, she said. He looked at her. Something moved in his face. Surprise, maybe, or the ghost of it. Elena. A pause. You look... I'm well, she said. If that's what you're about to say. His mouth closed. Cale was watching her with an expression she recognized. The reassessment of someone who'd expected a different reception and was recalibrating. Denny still had his hands in his pockets. He looked at the ground. We've come a long way, her father said. We'd like to come inside. There was a pause. It was Gideon's pause, and he used it deliberately, not rudely, but with the weight of a man who is going to grant the request but is going to let it be known that it is a request, not a right. Come in, he said. He looked at Elena as he said it, and the look was brief but clear. Your call, your house, I'm here. She walked ahead of them up the porch steps. Margaret was in the kitchen. She had, apparently, been in the kitchen for some time and had spent that time accomplishing what appeared to be a tremendous amount of cooking, which Elena recognized as Margaret's particular response to stress. Channel it into something productive that also fills the house with the smell of bread and makes everyone who walks in feel, however briefly and inappropriately, that things might be all right. The bread smelled extraordinary. Elena appreciated the gesture more than she could say. Sit down, Elena said to her family, at her own kitchen table, in her own house. Her father sat. He looked at the table, looked at the room, looked at Gideon standing near the doorway with his arms crossed and his expression neutral. Nice place, he said, in a tone that was trying to be conciliatory without quite committing to it. It is, Elena said. Seems like you've made yourself comfortable. I have. Cale leaned back in his chair with the loose-limbed ease he used when he was trying to establish that he was relaxed and in control of a situation. That's good, he said. That's what we were hoping. Came to make sure you were settled all right. That's considerate of you, Elena said. There was something in her voice, level, dry, not hostile, but with all the warmth removed, that made Cale's easy smile flicker. He glanced at their father. Her father folded his hands on the table. We've been worried, he said. Your mother especially. You're a long way from home. Elena looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had shaken her hand like a business associate and pocketed $30 and told her to be grateful. And she felt the thing she'd expected to feel. The old pull of it, the old trained response, the reflex toward apology and accommodation. And she felt it, and she let it pass through her without acting on it, the way you feel a current in water without letting it take you somewhere you don't want to go. I'm not far from home, she said. I'm in it. The kitchen went very quiet. Her father's expression shifted. Not anger yet, but the precursor to it, the hardening around the eyes. Elena, you came to see that I was settled, she said. I am. You can see that. The ranch is doing well. Mr. Ashcroft has been good to me, and I'm exactly where I choose to be. She put the emphasis on choose with a deliberateness that was impossible to miss. I appreciate the visit. Cale's jaw tightened. We're not done talking. You can stay for supper if you like, Elena said. Margaret's made bread. But the conversation is what I just told you it was. And that part's done. She watched her brother's face move through several things in quick succession. Surprise, anger. The recalculation of someone who has walked into a room expecting one situation and found another. He looked at Gideon. Gideon looked back at him with the steady patience of a man who could do this all day. Her father's hands tightened on the table. We'll stay for supper, he said finally, in a voice that was conceding the point without admitting it was a point. Margaret, from the stove, didn't say a word, but Elena caught the look on her face, the brief, fierce flash of something that was almost satisfaction, and pressed her lips together against something that would have been, in a different moment, a smile. Her father was not done. She knew that. This was the opening exchange, and he had not come all this way to be told the conversation was over and accepted in one sitting. But he had come expecting the girl who'd climbed into that wagon, and she was not that girl anymore, and he was going to have to figure out what to do with that. Supper was, by any objective measure, an extraordinary meal and an absolutely terrible evening. The bread was as good as it had smelled. No one threw anything. No one raised a voice. Not yet. Not that night. But the air at the table had the particular quality of air before lightning, when the charge is built and not yet discharged. And Elena sat at that big scarred table between Margaret and Gideon, and across from her father and brothers, and felt the two worlds of her life pressing against each other in the same room. And she breathed, and she did not look down. When her father and brothers rode out that evening to bed down at the inn in Red Rock, the kitchen felt like a room that had been returned to itself after a long loan. Gideon stood at the window watching them go. "They're not done," he said. "No," Elena agreed. "Tomorrow will be different." She knew it would be. Tomorrow would be the thing underneath tonight, the real conversation, the one where her father stopped being polite because he'd run out of patience for it. She knew how he worked. She'd had 22 years to learn. "I know," she said. She picked up the dishes. Margaret picked up the rest. Gideon moved away from the window and, without discussion, started heating water for the washing up. And the three of them moved around that kitchen in the kind of quiet that isn't empty but full, the kind that comes from people who have decided, without necessarily announcing it, that they are on the same side of something. Elena washed, Margaret dried, Gideon put things away, which meant he put some things in the wrong place, but she'd stopped correcting him about that because it seemed to be how he learned where things went, and she suspected he'd have the whole kitchen right in his head inside another month. Outside, the dark had settled over Ashcroft land. The creek was doing its quiet thing in the distance. Tomorrow was coming. She'd be there when it arrived. They came back the next morning before breakfast. Elena heard them from the kitchen, the horses on the drive, the particular rhythm of it, her father's horse with that slightly heavy footfall she'd known her whole life. She was at the stove and she didn't stop what she was doing. She turned the bacon, moved the pan off the hot side, wiped her hands on her apron. Then she went to the door. Gideon was already on the porch. He'd heard them too. Her father and Cale dismounted. Denny stayed on his horse, which told Elena something about how the morning had been planned. Denny was the one who could be sent back to town with a message if needed, or who could ride for someone if things went a particular direction. Her father had thought this through. He'd had all night at the inn in Red Rock to think it through, and the Robert Harrow who'd arrived this morning was not the one who'd sat at supper the previous evening making careful conversation. The careful was gone. What was left was the version of him she'd grown up with. "I'd like to speak to my daughter alone," he said to Gideon. "Good morning," Gideon said, not agreeing, not refusing, just redirecting the frame. Her father's jaw tightened. "Good morning. I'd like to speak to my daughter." "Elena's right there," Gideon said. "You can speak to her." Elena came down the porch steps. She stopped on the bottom one, which put her at eye level with her father, which was not something that had ever happened before in her life. She'd always been below him, literally or otherwise, and she looked at him and waited. "Come away from the porch," her father said to her. "I want to talk to you privately." "Anything you want to say to me you can say here," Elena said. His expression moved through several things. She could read them all: the surprise at her tone, the irritation underneath it, the calculation of a man deciding which approach was going to work. She'd spent 22 years reading that face, and she knew its grammar by heart. "Elena." He made her name into a particular shape, patient, worn down, the sound of a man being very reasonable with someone who was making it difficult. "I'm your father. I came a long way." "I know how far you came," she said. "Then you know this isn't... We're not here to cause trouble. We're here because your mother is worried, and I have obligations." "You don't have obligations to me," she said. "You made that clear when you took the $30. The yard went very quiet. Cale straightened. Danny, on his horse, looked at something in the middle distance with the focused attention of a man who has decided not to be present for this particular exchange. Her father's face did something she hadn't seen before, a flicker of something that was almost, not quite, shame. It was brief, and it was gone, and what replaced it was anger. That's not... He stopped. That was a business arrangement. It was a sale, Elena said. I heard you and Cale in the barn. $30 and a mule. You counted the coins twice. She kept her voice level. She was surprised, distantly, by how level it was. She'd imagined this conversation many times in the past weeks, imagined the shaking, the tears she'd promised herself she wouldn't have, and instead what she felt was something close to stillness. I'm not saying that to shame you in front of anyone. I'm saying it because I want you to hear that I know what happened, and I know what it means, and I need you to understand that before we talk about anything else. Her father looked at her for a long moment. Whatever he'd prepared to say on the ride over from Red Rock, this wasn't where he'd expected the conversation to go. Cale stepped forward. Cale had always been the one to step forward when their father needed momentum, the blunt instrument to Robert Harrow's more careful maneuvering. You've gotten some ideas in your head, Cale said. His voice had the flat, dismissive quality she'd heard her whole life, the one designed to make whatever she said sound like the product of confused thinking. 6 weeks with this man, and you think you know how the world works. I've known how the world works for considerably longer than 6 weeks, Elena said. You don't know what you're talking about. Cale. That was Gideon. One word, spoken quietly, but with a quality to it that made Cale stop and look at him. Gideon had come down from the porch and was standing a few feet behind Elena, not in front of her, not blocking her, but present in a way that was impossible to ignore. She's talking. Let her talk. Cale's eyes moved between Gideon and Elena with the quick calculation of a man reassessing odds. He was bigger than Gideon in the broad, heavy way, but there was something about Gideon's stillness that didn't invite testing. Cale had the instinct, if not always the intelligence to act on it, for recognizing when a man was not bluffing. He stepped back. Not far, but back. Her father cleared his throat. This isn't about money, he said, which was such a complete reversal of the previous 30 seconds that it might have been comical under different circumstances. This is about family. Whatever mistakes were made, they weren't mistakes, Elena said. Whatever happened, you are still my daughter, and I have a right. You don't, she said. That's what I'm trying to tell you. You gave up whatever rights you're talking about when you put a price on me and sent me away. She paused. And even before that, before the money. You had 22 years and you spent them telling me I was a burden. Every single day, in one way or another, you made sure I knew I wasn't worth keeping. Her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, just once. And she hated it, but she didn't stop. I'm not saying that to hurt you. I'm saying it because it's true, and I'm tired of walking around it like it isn't. The yard was very still. Even the horses had gone quiet. Her father's face had changed. The anger was still there, but something else had come into it. Not remorse exactly. She wasn't going to tell herself it was remorse. But something that was at least a recognition that the ground had shifted and he hadn't noticed until he was standing on the wrong side of it. You've always been dramatic, he said, but it came out weakly without the weight it would have carried 6 weeks ago. No, Elena said. I've always been quiet. There's a difference. Cale made a sound, half laugh, half frustration. The sound of a man who doesn't have a good argument and knows it and resents knowing it. So what, you're staying here? With him? He nodded at Gideon with the particular contempt of someone gesturing at evidence. Look at him, Elena. You think this is what you deserve? Elena looked at Cale for a long moment. She looked at him with the same steady gray-green eyes that had been looking at him her whole life, that he'd ignored and dismissed and looked past for 24 years, and she let him feel the look. Yes, she said. I do. Cale blinked. Whatever he'd expected her to say, it wasn't that. He turned to Gideon. You've done something to her head. Filled it up with... I haven't filled her head with anything, Gideon said. He said it without heat, which somehow made it more final than anger would have. She came here capable of thinking for herself. I'd imagine she always was. He looked at Robert Harrow directly. Your daughter is here of her own choosing. She's been doing the work of this ranch alongside us, and she's been doing it well, and she is free to stay as long as she wants to stay. That's the situation. A pause. If you'd like to have a civil conversation with her, you're welcome to it. But you don't get to tell her what to do on my land." Her father stared at him. The stare of a man who has spent his life being the largest presence in any room he entered and has walked into a room where someone is occupying that space already and doesn't know what to do about it. "She's my daughter," he said for the third time. He kept returning to it like a man trying a locked door. "She's a grown woman," Gideon said. "She was a grown woman when you put her on a wagon and sent her away. You can't have it both the ways you want it." Something broke in her father's face then. Elena watched it happen, watched the anger find the edge of something underneath it that might have been, in a different man, grief. He was not a man who felt things clearly. She'd understood that about him for a long time. Whatever he felt about his children, about his daughter, it had always come out sideways, through control and diminishment and the particular cruelty of low expectations. It wasn't love, what he was showing her. But it wasn't nothing either, and looking at it was harder than she'd expected. She did not soften, but she breathed through the hardness of it. "I'm not going back," she said quietly. "That's the end of it. Not today, not in a month. This is my life now, and I'm building it here, and I'm asking you to leave me to it." Her father looked at her for a long time. Cale had gone to stand by his horse, his back to the yard, his shoulders tight with something he wasn't saying. Denny, still mounted, was looking at Elena with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not quite apology, not quite regret, something complicated that he probably didn't have the vocabulary to say out loud. Then Denny said, very quietly, "She looks good, Pa." Everyone looked at him. He shrugged, the shrug of a man who knows he's said the wrong thing in the wrong company and has decided to say it anyway. "She looks like she's all right, that's all I'm saying." Her father made a sound that wasn't quite a word. He turned to his horse. He put his foot in the stirrup, and he pulled himself up, and he sat there for a moment looking down at Elena from the height of the saddle with an expression that she filed away carefully, not to interpret yet, not here. And then he turned the horse. "Cale," he said. Cale mounted, still not looking at her. Her father looked at Gideon. "You'll take care of her." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't exactly a request. It was something between the two, the last available move of a man who has come to take back something and found it was no longer his to take. "She takes care of herself," Gideon said. "I'm just the one who gets to watch." Something moved across her father's face. Then he clicked his tongue at the horse and rode out of the yard. Cale followed without a word. Denny paused. He looked at Elena from the saddle with those unreadable eyes, and he said, "I told him not to come," which was the most Denny had ever said to her, possibly in his life. Then he turned his horse and rode after them. Elena stood in the yard and watched them go. She waited until they were around the bend and the sound of the horses had faded back into the ordinary sounds of the property. The wind, the creek, the horses in the far pasture doing their slow, incurious morning movements. She stood there a few seconds past the point where she was sure they were gone. Then her legs did something she hadn't authorized them to do. A slight weakening at the knees, and she sat down on the bottom porch step because it was the nearest available surface, and she needed one. Gideon sat down next to her, not saying anything, not touching her. Just sitting there with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped, present in the same way he'd been present in the barn during the storm. Not trying to fix the thing, just being a body in the space that was also her space, so she wasn't in it alone. She pressed the heels of her hands against her knees and breathed. "That was harder than I thought it would be," she said after a while. "Usually is," he said. "I didn't cry." "No, you didn't." "I thought I would." He was quiet for a moment. "You looked like you were going to, once. When you talked about—" He stopped. "About not being worth keeping," she said. "Yeah." She looked out at the drive, at the empty space where 3 horses had been standing 10 minutes ago. The morning had gone very ordinary around them. A hawk circling high above the east pasture, a horse at the far fence line nosing at the frozen ground for the last of the autumn grass. The world persisting in its practical way, entirely indifferent to what had just happened in this yard. "My brother Denny," she said. "He told my father he'd advised against coming." "I heard." "That's the most decent thing he's ever said to me." A pause. "Which probably sounds worse than I mean it." "It sounds true," Gideon said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the drive too, his profile toward her, the scarred side, the pull of silver skin over his jaw. She'd stopped seeing it as a separate thing. It was just his face now, just what he looked like. The way everything about a person becomes ordinary with enough proximity. "You said I take care of myself," she said. He turned to look at her. "You do." "I know. She searched for the words. "I've been taking care of myself for a long time, by myself. And it was—" She looked back at the drive. "Having someone standing behind me. Not in front, not making it their thing, just behind." A small exhale. That was different. Gideon didn't say anything for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful in the way it got when he was saying something he'd measured before he committed to it. "You don't have to take care of yourself alone anymore. If you don't want to." The morning sat around them, cold and bright and entirely ordinary. Elena looked at the drive for a long time. She was thinking about her father's face as he rode out. That last thing she'd seen there. The thing she hadn't let herself interpret yet. She thought maybe it was something she would need to put away somewhere and look at later, when she had more distance. Maybe what it meant was simpler than she wanted it to be. Maybe he'd looked at her standing in that yard, in her work clothes with her chin up and her voice steady, and seen someone he hadn't expected to see. Maybe it meant nothing at all. She wasn't sure it mattered. What mattered was the yard, and the morning, and the ordinary sounds of the ranch going on around her, and Gideon sitting on the porch step beside her with his elbows on his knees, not going anywhere. "Margaret's going to come out here in about 2 minutes," Elena said, "and ask if we want more coffee, and it'll be her way of checking whether everyone's still alive." "Probably," Gideon said. "I'm going to say yes." "Good. It's cold." Elena looked at him sideways. The ghost of something crossed his face, that almost smile, the one that lived on the right side and appeared when he stopped monitoring it, and she'd learned to watch for it the way you watch for the first light before sunrise, that quality of something about to happen. "Thank you," she said. He met her eyes. "You did that yourself." "I know," she said. "Thank you anyway." The kitchen door opened behind them. Margaret appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a woman who has been listening from inside and waiting a tactful amount of time before emerging, which in Margaret's case was approximately 2.5 minutes. "Nobody's dead," she observed. "Nobody's dead," Elena confirmed. "Coffee? Please." Margaret came down and handed the cups over and stood on the step above them with her own cup, looking out at the drive with the proprietary satisfaction of someone surveying a recently defended border. She didn't ask what had been said or how it had gone. She could read the yard the same way she read most situations, quickly, accurately, and without requiring everything to be explained to her. After a moment she said, "The bread's getting cold." "We're coming," Elena said. But neither of them moved quite yet. They sat a little longer on the step, in the cold, bright morning, with the hawk still circling above the east pasture and the horses moving in the far field and the creek doing its low, continuous sound in the distance. Elena drank her coffee and let the warmth of it work its way down into her chest, where something was still a little raw, still a little tender, the way a bruise is tender after the initial pain has passed. It would be there for a while, she knew that. Some things took time to stop hurting even after you'd won, but she was still here. Her father's horse was gone down the road, and she was still here, on this step, on this land, with these people. She had not bowed her head. For the first time in 22 years, she had not bowed her head, and the sky had not fallen and the ground had not opened, and she was still, simply and solidly, here. She stood up. Gideon stood up beside her. They went inside. The days that followed were quiet in the way of things that have been through a storm and are still deciding what shape they'll take afterward. Elena noticed the quiet first in herself, a kind of loosening she hadn't expected, like a knot that had been pulled tight for so long she'd forgotten it was there, until suddenly it wasn't. She still woke before dawn. She still went to the stove and made coffee in the cold kitchen before anyone else stirred. But the weight that had been sitting underneath those mornings since her father's letter arrived had lifted, and the absence of it was something she kept noticing, the way you notice a tooth that stopped aching. She didn't talk about it much. That wasn't her way. And she was coming to understand it wasn't Gideon's either, which was one of the things about him she'd filed quietly into the column marked "This Matters." They were both people who processed things by working, by moving through the ordinary demands of a day until the thing that needed settling had settled on its own. Margaret was different. Margaret processed by talking, rapidly and at length, until she'd examined every angle of a thing and declared a verdict. But even Margaret seemed to understand that the morning after the confrontation in the yard was not a morning that required commentary. She made a large breakfast, kept the coffee coming, and talked about the horses instead, which was as considerate as Margaret got and which Elena genuinely appreciated. What Elena hadn't anticipated was how the yard confrontation would travel. She'd known, in an abstract way, that Red Rock was a small enough place that word moved. Mrs. Calloway at the dry goods counter had demonstrated that clearly enough, but the speed of it still caught her off guard. Within 4 days, she was getting looks in town that she hadn't gotten before. Not all of them bad, which was the part that surprised her. Some of them were still the calculating looks of people who had decided what the story was and were measuring her against it. But some of them were different. The feed store owner, a taciturn man named Garrett, who had never previously acknowledged her existence beyond the minimum required by commerce, held the door for her and said, "Morning, Miss Harrow," with a straightforward respect that she hadn't heard in his voice before. She mentioned this to Gideon that evening. "Word got out," he said, without looking up from the harness he was mending at the kitchen table. He did this sometimes, brought barn work inside in the evenings, to Margaret's ongoing exasperation and his own complete comfort. "About what you said to your father." "Horace?" Elena guessed. "Horace was at the inn when your family stayed there." He pulled a stitch tight. "He has opinions about people who treat women like cargo. He's been known to share them." Elena thought about the man who'd driven her wagon all the way from her father's farm to Red Rock without saying much, who'd brought her supper and paid for a room and answered her questions in short but honest sentences, and who apparently had also been quietly carrying a grievance on her behalf that she hadn't known about. "I should thank him," she said. "He'd tell you it wasn't your business," Gideon said, "but he'd appreciate it." She did, the following week, when Horace came by the ranch to help move some lumber for a repair to the storage shed that the storm had damaged. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, and Horace looked at the middle distance for a moment and then said, "Woman does right by the animals, she's got common sense," which from Horace was approximately equivalent to a speech. The storage shed repair took 3 days. Elena worked alongside Horace and Gideon, hauling boards and holding things in place while nails were driven, learning the particular vocabulary of the task as she went. She wasn't skilled at it, not yet. Carpentry was not one of the things her father's farm had required of her. But she was strong, and she was quick to understand what was needed. And by the second day, Gideon was giving her directions without the slight hesitation she'd noticed at first. The half-second of recalculation when a man has been working alone and is adjusting to a second pair of hands. On the third day, when the new roof section was going up, Horace looked at the work from the ground and said, "She's plumb," with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been worried about a thing and found it correct. "Finally," Gideon said, "first try went wrong because someone was hasty." "The first try went wrong because the ground settled," Gideon said, in the tone of a man revisiting an old argument. "The ground didn't settle on its own." Elena listened to this exchange with the private interest she always took in watching Gideon be contradicted by someone he respected. He accepted it differently than he accepted contradiction from people he didn't respect, less closed, more willing to let the thing land and examine it. "The ground settled," he said, but with less conviction. Horace said nothing, which meant he'd won. It was somewhere as that third day of the shed repair, with sawdust in her hair and her arms tired from holding boards at an awkward angle, that Elena understood something she'd been circling for weeks without quite naming it. She belonged here, not in the temporary way of a person who has found a tolerable arrangement, not in the grateful way of someone who has been taken in, but in the settled, unsentimental way of a person who has found the place that fits the shape of them. She fit here. The work, the rhythms, the particular combination of people, the way the land looked in the morning and the way it smelled before rain. She fit. She was not going to ruin it by saying so out loud. Not yet. Some things needed to be carried quietly for a while before they could bear being spoken. But she knew. It was 2 weeks after her father's visit that Gideon said the thing he'd been not saying. They were in the barn after supper, Elena checking on Cinder, who had developed a habit of expecting a visit in the evening since the storm, and Gideon doing something with the saddle that was taking longer than it should have because he kept stopping. Elena had noticed the stops. She'd been noticing them for several days, actually, a quality in Gideon of something pending, something he was carrying close to the surface and putting back down every time it got close to coming out. She waited. She was patient about this kind of thing. She'd learned young that if you pushed people toward things they weren't ready to say, you got the wrong version of whatever it was. He put the saddle down. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about before, about the fire." Elena leaned against Cinder's stall door and said nothing, which was her way of saying, "Go ahead." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see the effort of it, not performing difficulty, genuinely working through something. He was not a man who told his own story easily. She suspected he didn't tell it often. "I had a family," he said. "Wife. We'd been married 3 years. We had a place, not here, further south, different territory. There was a fire in the main house, middle of the night." A pause. She didn't get out. The barn was very still. "I got to her," he said, "too late. Got myself burned getting there. And then He stopped. "I spent about 2 years after that not doing anything much worth doing, drinking, mostly, moving around, being—" He picked up a word and put it down and tried another one. "Absent. From everything." "And then you came here," Elena said quietly. "And then I came here, bought the worst piece of land in the territory from a man who'd given up on it and used everything I had left." He looked at the floor. "Margaret came out a year later. She'd been worried about me, and she doesn't sit still with worry, so she just showed up. The ghost of that almost smile, brief and tired. She fixed the kitchen first." "That sounds like her." "Yeah." He was quiet again. I don't tell people, because there's nothing to do with it, and it just makes them look at me differently, more carefully, like they're waiting for something to break." He looked up. "You don't look at me like that." "No," Elena said. "I noticed that early on." She looked at him across the barn, this careful, private man, with his burned face and his 8 years of deliberate rebuilding, who noticed things and didn't always say what he noticed, and had spent a long time being alone before he'd decided to try for something else. "Why are you telling me now?" she asked. He thought about it. "Because you told me your short version," he said. "Back in the beginning, by the fire, and you didn't ask for mine in return. And I've been thinking since then that—" He stopped, found the words. "That was decent of you, and I wanted you to have it, if you wanted it." Elena was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry about your wife," she said. "It was a long time ago." "That doesn't always make it shorter." He looked at her, and something in his face shifted. Something opening, just slightly, the way a door opens when the pressure on both sides finally equalizes. "No," he said. "It doesn't." They stood in the barn for a little while with that between them. Not uncomfortable, not requiring resolution. Just two people who had told each other the hard things and were letting those things settle. "Cinder's going to want her apple," Elena said eventually. "She always wants the apple. She's figured out I bring one." "She tells the other horses," Gideon said. "They've all started expecting it now." "That's your fault for having smart horses." "That," he said, "is the first thing you've said that I actually disagree with." Elena found the apple in her coat pocket. She had, in fact, brought one, and fed it to Cinder over the stall door, and the mare took it with the delicate greed of an animal that knows exactly what it wants and has learned that patience gets it there faster than demanding. Elena scratched behind her ears while she ate. "You ever think about leaving?" Gideon asked. He was back to the saddle now, working again, but his voice had the quality of a question that had been waiting longer than tonight. "Leaving here?" she asked. "Yeah." She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she'd learned to think about things. "No," she said. "Not anymore. I think about what would have happened if I hadn't gotten on that wagon sometimes. But that's different." "What do you think would have happened?" "I would have stayed small," she said. "I would have stayed exactly as small as they needed me to be, and eventually I'd have believed it was the right size." She paused. "I was almost there. That's the part that, when I think about it, that's the part that's hard. How close I was to just accepting the size of things. He worked at the saddle for a moment. "You were never going to stay that small," he said. "You didn't know me then." "No, but I can see what you are." He said it simply, without the weight of a compliment, just as an observation. "You don't stay small, it's not in how you're built." Elena looked at Cinder, who had finished the apple and was now investigating her coat pocket for a follow-up offering with the optimism of a creature that has no concept of disappointment. "You're out of luck," she told the mayor. Cinder blew air at her reproachfully. What happened in the second week of December arrived so quietly that Elena almost missed the shape of it. She and Gideon had been out checking the north fence line, a job that required 2 people because one section had a gate with a broken latch that needed holding while the other worked on it, and they'd been out longer than planned because the latch was more broken than it had appeared from a distance, the way things often were. The work had required them to be close together in the particular physical way of people collaborating on a mechanical problem, hands sometimes in the same space, adjusting and readjusting, and somewhere in the middle of the third attempt to get the latch pin seated correctly. Elena had looked up and found Gideon looking at her from a distance of approximately 8 inches, and neither of them had moved. She could see the scar clearly at that distance, the pulled skin along his jaw, the slight difference in texture where the old burn had healed over years into something permanent. She'd stopped registering it as separate from him, but at 8 inches it was simply there, simply part of the face she'd been looking at for 2 months now, and she was aware of it, and aware of him, and aware that she was not moving back. "The pin's going to need replacing," she said. "Yeah," he said. He had not moved either. "We'll need to go into town for the right hardware." "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. Neither of them moved for another second. Then the gate swung in the wind and they both reached for it at the same time, their hands landing on the rail within an inch of each other, and the moment broke with the practical urgency of a gate that was going to damage itself further if they didn't secure it. They rode back to the ranch without talking much, which was not unusual. But the quality of the silence was different, and they both knew it. Margaret knew it too. She had a preternatural ability to read rooms and yards and dinner tables, and people who had just ridden in from fence repairs. And when they came into the kitchen, she looked at them with the expression of someone confirming a hypothesis, and then looked very deliberately at the pot on the stove and said nothing whatsoever, which from Margaret was practically deafening. That night, Elena lay in her room with the cedar-smelling quilt and the window that showed a sky full of December stars, and she thought about what she was feeling with the same honest attention she brought to everything. Not the careful inventory of someone trying to talk herself out of it, just looking at it plainly. She had feelings for Gideon Ashcroft. She'd had them for some time, probably since the barn during the storm, maybe before, and she'd been managing them with the patience of someone who understood that a thing needed the right moment and that forcing the moment was how you ruined the thing. The question was whether the moment was approaching or whether she was misreading it, which was possible. She had limited experience with being correctly read by people who were supposed to care about her, and even more limited experience with reading people correctly in return. She turned onto her side. "Don't be stupid," she told herself, "but don't be so careful you miss it." It was the most useful advice she'd given herself in years. The hardware trip to Red Rock the next day was, by any objective standard, not an eventful occasion. They drove into town, went to the hardware store, found the right pin for the gate latch. Garrett nodded at them from across the street. Mrs. Calloway was visible through the window of the dry goods store and appeared to be assembling an opinion, but made no move toward the door, which Elena considered a victory. On the way back, somewhere on the straight stretch of road between town and the ranch, where the red hills rose on one side and the flat scrubland spread on the other, Gideon said without particular preamble, "I'd like to ask you something." "All right," Elena said. "When your father came, when he was standing in the yard..." A pause. "You said this was your home, that you were building your life here." "I remember." "I want to know if you meant that." She looked at him. He was watching the road, not her, which she suspected was intentional, giving her the space of his not looking. "I meant it," she said. "All of it? He stopped. Started again. "I'm not good at this," he said, which was so plainly true and so plainly admitted that she felt something warm move through her chest. "I've been sitting with something for a while and I'm not sure how to say it without either saying too much or not enough." "Try the middle," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily. The red hills went past. I want you to stay, he said. Not because the ranch needs another pair of hands, not because Margaret needs the help, because... He stopped. Because these past 2 months have been the first time in a long time that I've... He searched for the word. Looked forward to mornings. Elena looked at the road. She thought about the oak tree at the edge of her father's property, the one she'd almost cried over on the way out. She thought about the $30 and the mule. She thought about the letter and the yard and her father's face as he rode away, and she thought about the barn in the storm and a frightened mare and a man who had come in and closed the door against the cold and stood beside her without taking over. She thought about mornings, about the particular quality of mornings here, the stove and the cold kitchen and the coffee and the sound of the ranch coming awake outside the windows, and how none of it had ever felt like waiting, how it had just felt like a day beginning. I look forward to mornings too, she said, in case that wasn't clear. He looked at her then, full on, with those dark, careful eyes, and she looked back, and it was not the look of two strangers examining the possibility of a shared future anymore. That examination was long finished. This was something else. Two people who had looked at each other honestly, over 2 months of hard work and harder conversations and one very bad storm and one very bad morning in a yard, and had decided that what they saw was worth keeping. All right, he said. All right, she said. The horses carried them home through the December afternoon, through the country that was cold and red and spare and, by any measure Elena had ever applied to a landscape, completely, quietly beautiful. They fixed the gate latch the following morning. It took about 20 minutes once they had the right pin, which was always the way with things. The finding of the right piece was the hard part. The work itself almost anticlimactic once you had what you needed. Elena held the gate while Gideon seated the pin, and when it clicked into place and the latch moved clean and easy, he tested it 3 times with the particular thoroughness of a man who does things once and does them right. And Elena watched him do it and felt, very quietly and without ceremony, something she recognized as happiness. Not the large, declarative kind. The other kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself. That you find sitting in an ordinary moment like a coin in a coat pocket. Small and solid and real. She'd been finding it more often lately. December settled over the ranch with the serious intent of a season that knew its job. The cold came down from the north in earnest, frosting the water troughs each morning and turning the breath of the horses into small clouds in the barn air. The days shortened. The work adjusted itself accordingly. More of it moving indoors, more of it focused on winterizing, checking insulation in the animal shelters, laying in wood, making sure everything that needed to withstand the next few months was actually going to. Elena threw herself into it with the same deliberate attention she brought to everything, and the work filled her days in a way she'd come to appreciate not just practically, but in some deeper, harder-to-name way. She'd thought once that keeping busy was a form of hiding, that if you were always working, you never had to sit still with the things that were wrong with your life. And maybe for some years it had been that. But this wasn't the same. This work was hers. The results of it were hers. When she fixed something, it stayed fixed, and she knew it, and it mattered in a way that had nothing to do with someone else's approval or someone else's list of requirements. That was the difference she was learning, between work that swallows you and work that builds you, between labor as survival and labor as... She didn't have a clean word for it. Investment, maybe, in something that was yours and going to keep being yours tomorrow. Gideon noticed the difference in her, she thought. He didn't say so directly. He rarely said things directly if a look or a well-placed silence would do. But she caught him watching her sometimes with that expression she'd been cataloging since the beginning, the one that had gone from unreadable to simply familiar. He watched her the way a person watches something they're glad exists. She tried not to make too much of it and mostly failed. What they were to each other had not been formalized, discussed, or given any particular name, which was entirely in keeping with how both of them operated. The conversation in the wagon on the way back from Red Rock had said what needed saying, and the rest of it was unfolding at its own pace, the way things did when 2 cautious people with complicated histories decided they were going to let something happen without forcing it into a shape before it was ready. Margaret, for her part, was exercising a restraint that was clearly costing her something. "You don't have to not say anything," Elena told her one evening in the kitchen, when Margaret's expression of deliberate non-commentary had reached a pitch of such intensity that it was essentially the loudest thing in the room. "I'm not saying anything," Margaret said. "I know, that's what I mean." Margaret looked at her. Then she looked at the ceiling. Then she said, with the compressed energy of someone who has been holding something in for several weeks, "I just want you to know that I am very happy about the general direction of things, and I'm choosing to express that by making a large pie." "That's very restrained of you." "It's the most restrained I've been in years. It's taking real effort." Elena smiled, a full one, which still surprised her sometimes. The ease of it, how it had gotten easier over these months. "Make an apple one," she said. "Cinder will appreciate the peelings." Margaret laughed, and the kitchen filled up with it, and Elena thought that if she'd been told 6 months ago that she'd be standing in a kitchen in Red Rock Country laughing with a woman who'd become something close to a sister, she'd have assumed whoever was telling her had the wrong person. It was 3 days before Christmas when the second letter arrived. This one was not from her father. She recognized Denny's handwriting on the envelope. Looser than her father's, less deliberate. The writing of a man who'd learned it the same way he'd learned most things, reluctantly and imperfectly. She opened it at the kitchen table while her coffee went cold. It was short. Denny had never been a writer. "Elena, I've been thinking about what you said in the yard. I don't have much to say about most of it, except that you were right, and I knew it, and said nothing for too long. Pa's not going to write. That's just how he is. But I wanted you to know Ma asks about you. She doesn't say she's sorry. You know how she is, but she asks. I thought you should know that. I hope the ranch is good. You looked like yourself out there. I don't know how else to put it. Denny." Elena read it twice. Then she folded it and held it in her hands for a moment. She tried to examine what she felt about it honestly. There was something, not warmth exactly, not the kind of warmth that would have required more from Denny than he'd ever managed to give, but it was something. The small, complicated something of a person who has written a letter they didn't have to write, who has said a thing that cost them something, however little that thing was by other measures. "You looked like yourself." She thought about that. She wasn't sure Denny had ever looked at her closely enough to know what herself looked like. But maybe the contrast had made it obvious. The woman who'd stood in that yard compared to the girl they'd watched get on a wagon without saying goodbye. Maybe even Denny could see the difference. She put the letter in the kitchen drawer, which was where she kept things she wasn't ready to throw away or think about further. That evening, she told Gideon about it. They were by the fire after supper, Margaret having excused herself early on the grounds of a letter she needed to write to a friend in the next county, which Elena suspected was invented to give them the room. Gideon listened. He had the quality of real listening, not the kind where a person is constructing their response while you talk, but the kind where they are actually taking in what you're saying and letting it be there before they say anything about it. "How do you feel about it?" he asked when she finished. "Complicated," she said. "That seems right. I'm not going to go back there, or reconnect, or whatever the word is. That's not what I want." She looked at the fire. "But I'm not sure I want them to simply not exist either. I don't know what I want from them." "You don't have to know yet," he said. "No? Some things take a long time to figure out. That's not a failure of figuring." She glanced at him sideways. "Is that something you know from experience?" "It's something I know from about 4 years of sitting in this house not knowing what I felt about things," he said, which was as direct as she'd heard him about his own history. "It took Margaret showing up and refusing to let me stay unclear indefinitely." A small pause. "She's useful that way." "She is," Elena agreed. They sat for a while. The fire burned. Outside, the wind was doing something persistent and cold against the windows. The kind of wind that made the indoors feel specifically good by contrast, made the warmth and the light feel deliberate and chosen. "What do you want?" Gideon asked. "Not from your family, from here, from this." He said this carefully, with the slight emphasis of someone indicating more than the room. Elena thought about how to answer honestly. It was a question she'd been living toward for 2 months without exactly framing it that way. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to keep doing the work and know that it matters. I want—" She stopped, found the real version of it. "I want to stop being surprised when someone is decent to me. I want that to just be ordinary. The baseline. She looked at the fire. I don't think that's a small thing to want, actually. I think for some people it just is the baseline and they've never had to want it, and for other people it's the whole project. Gideon was quiet for a moment. It's not a small thing, he said. No. And the other part, he said it carefully. The not being surprised by decency, specifically. She looked at him. You've been decent to me since the first day, she said. That's not a surprise anymore. Something moved through his expression, not the almost smile, something less guarded than that. Something she didn't have a name for because she hadn't seen it on a person's face directed at her before. Good, he said. Is that all you're going to say? For now, he said. Then after a beat, I'm also going to ask you to marry me, but I'm going to do it properly, not by a fire on a random evening in December. Elena went still. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the dark, careful eyes and the complete stillness of a man who has said the thing he meant to say and is not going to unsay it. All right, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. When? When I've thought of the right way. I don't need anything elaborate. I know you don't, he said. That's not why I want to do it right. She held that for a moment. The fire popped. The wind pressed the windows. All right, she said again, which was becoming their word, she'd noticed. The word they used when something had been decided, and both of them knew it, and neither of them needed it to be louder than it was. He asked her on Christmas morning. There was nothing theatrical about it, which was entirely appropriate for who he was. He found her in the barn before the house was awake. She'd gone out early to check on the animals, as she always did, and he came out 20 minutes later in his work coat with his hair unsettled and his hands in his pockets, and he stood in the barn aisle with the cold coming through the gaps in the boards, and Cinder watching the both of them with the interested expression of a horse that expects to be involved in whatever was happening. He did not kneel, which she was glad of. It would have felt wrong, too much like the gestures of a different kind of story than theirs. He just stood in front of her and looked at her and said, I meant what I said by the fire. Will you marry me, Elena? Not Miss Harrow. Elena. She'd been Elena to him for a while now, but hearing it in this particular sentence had a weight she wasn't entirely prepared for. She felt it go all the way down. Yes, she said. No elaboration, no speech, just yes, and the particular quality of the silence after it, the kind that comes when something real has been said in a room and the room is absorbing it. Cinder pushed her nose against Elena's shoulder. She approves, Elena said. She wants an apple, Gideon said. She always wants an apple. She can still approve. He reached out and took her hand, which was the first time he'd done that, and her hand in his was cold from the morning, and his was warm. And they stood there in the barn for a moment that she was going to carry with her for the rest of her life. Not because it was perfect. It wasn't. It was a cold barn in December with a horse trying to get into her coat pocket. But because it was absolutely, entirely real. They were married in February, in the front room of the ranch house, with Horace as a witness, and Margaret crying with an enthusiasm that she would later deny had been crying and characterized instead as a strong reaction to the cold air, even though every window was shut. The minister from Red Rock performed the ceremony. It took about 15 minutes. Elena wore her best dress, which was not a wedding dress, but was a good dark blue that she thought suited her, and Gideon wore a clean shirt and had clearly made some attempt at his hair. And when they stood across from each other in that front room with the fire going and the winter light coming through the windows, she looked at him and thought, with the particular clarity of a person seeing something true, that she had not known, 6 months ago, that this was where she was going. She had not known there was somewhere to go. That was the thing she kept coming back to in the months that followed. The thing that felt like it mattered beyond her own story, if she was being honest with herself about it. Not that she'd been rescued, not that she'd been found and fixed. She hadn't been. She'd been the same person the whole time, the same person who'd gotten on that wagon with a small bundle in her lap and her eyes straight ahead, the same person who'd been told her whole life she wasn't enough. What had changed was that she'd stopped believing it. That was all. That was everything. The whole long, complicated project of the past 6 months had been, at its center, one person deciding that the story other people told about her was not the final word on what she was. It sounded simple. It was not simple. It was the hardest thing she'd ever done, and she'd done it without knowing she was doing it. one morning at a time, one choice at a time, until one day she was standing in a barn in December saying yes and meaning it with everything she had. Spring came slowly that year, the way it does in high country. Reluctant, 2 steps forward and 1 step back, snow in April, and then a week of such brilliant warm light that it felt like an apology. The ranch woke back up with the season. The horses came back into their full energy, Cinder leading the others in their morning circuits of the far pasture with the exuberance of an animal that has been waiting for exactly this. The fence lines needed checking after the winter. There was always something. Elena discovered, come April, that she was going to have a child. She told Gideon on a Tuesday evening, factually, without preamble, because that was how she said things, and she watched his face move through something that started as stillness and ended somewhere she didn't have a clean word for. Not uncomplicated. She hadn't expected it to be uncomplicated. He'd lost a wife, had carried that loss for years, and the things that grief touches don't simply untouch themselves. She knew that. He sat with it for a moment. Then he said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "And you're glad?" She looked at him. "I'm scared," she said honestly. "And yes." He nodded. She watched him working through something, watched him put the weight of the old grief down in the way a person does when they decide, consciously and with real effort, that the past is not going to run the future. It wasn't quick, and it wasn't smooth, and she loved him for not pretending it was. "We're going to need to sort out the small bedroom," he said finally. "Margaret's already mentally rearranging it," Elena said. "She just doesn't know why yet." He looked at her. "How long have you known?" 4 days? "And you didn't tell her?" "I told you first." Something moved through his expression, simple and clear and human. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. Margaret, when they told her at supper, did not cry. She put down her fork and looked at both of them, and then looked at the ceiling and said, "Finally," with the tone of a woman whose hypothesis has been confirmed after a lengthy experimental period. Then she picked her fork back up and said, "The small bedroom faces east. Good light. We'll need to fix the window latch before winter." "I know," Gideon said. "The draft in that room is unreasonable." "I know, Margaret. I'm just saying it needs to be addressed." "We'll address it," Elena said, and the three of them went on eating, at the big scarred table with the oil lamp between them and the spring evening going dark outside the windows. And it was ordinary in the way that things are ordinary when they're also exactly right. The summer that followed was not easy or uncomplicated, because nothing worth anything ever is. The work was harder with Elena's changing body making certain things impractical, and she chafed against it, against the adjustments and the accommodations, against the moments when she had to stop and ask for help with things she'd been doing herself for months. She didn't like needing help. She was working on that. Gideon, for his part, was working on not overreacting every time she did something strenuous, which was a project she could see him managing with considerable effort and imperfect success. They argued about it once, directly, which was new. They were both people who'd learned to manage disagreement by going quiet rather than loud, but the quiet on this one had filled up too much and required emptying. "I'm not made of glass," she said. "I know that," he said. "You watch me like I am." "I watch you like someone who—" He stopped. "I know you're not fragile. I know that better than most people. It's not about what I know." She looked at him. "It's about her," she said, not unkindly. A long pause. "Some of it," he said. "I'm not going to break," she said. I'm not going to leave, and I know you know that. But knowing a thing and feeling it are different, and I understand that, so I'm not angry at you. I'm just asking you to try." She paused. "And I'll try not to do stupid things to prove a point." He looked at her for a moment. "That's more than fair," he said. "I thought so too." They got better at it. The way people who are paying attention get better at things, unevenly, with setbacks, but the general direction holding. The child was born in November, late in the month, on a night that was cold enough to see the stars with unusual clarity through the bedroom window. A girl. She arrived loudly, and with the apparent conviction that the world needed to be informed of her presence immediately, which Margaret said was a very good sign. They named her Ruth, which had been Gideon's mother's name, and which Elena had approved when he offered it with the hesitation of a man not sure if naming something after his past was allowed in the context of his present. She told him that the past didn't have to be kept separate from the present to be respected, which he'd turned over for a while and then said he thought she was right. Ruth Ashcroft was not an easy baby. She slept in intervals that seemed deliberately designed to prevent any adult in the household from sleeping for more than 2 consecutive hours. And she had opinions about feeding and temperature and the particular blanket that was acceptable and the several that were not. And she communicated all of these opinions at full volume with the assurance of someone who has already determined that the world is going to accommodate her preferences. Elena, exhausted and sore and operating on minimal sleep, looked at her daughter one morning in the gray pre-dawn light, holding her against her chest while the rest of the house slept, because Ruth had decided that 3 in the morning was a reasonable time to be awake and alert and interested in the ceiling, and thought about the girl who had once sat in the dark in a back bedroom with her hands flat on her thighs, deciding something. She'd been deciding, she understood now, to survive, which was necessary and had been the right call, but was also the smallest version of what she'd eventually done. What she'd eventually done was choose. Over and over, in small ways and large ones, she'd chosen. The wagon, the work, the steadiness in the yard when her father's horses came up the drive, the yes in the barn on a December morning. Her daughter looked up at her with the unfocused intensity of a very new person encountering the world for the first time, and Elena looked back and she thought, I am going to make sure you know, your whole life, that choosing is something you're allowed to do, not because someone will protect you from the consequences. Because you have the right to stand in your own yard and speak your own truth and walk back inside when you're done, and the sky will not fall. It was, she thought, the best thing she had to give. When Gideon found them an hour later, drawn downstairs by the quiet that meant the crying had stopped, which had become, perversely, the sound that woke him, he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Elena in the chair by the stove with Ruth against her chest, and the expression on his face was the one she'd been watching develop over more than a year now, the one that had started as careful and unreadable and had become something she recognized completely. She's asleep, Elena said quietly. Finally, he said, don't jinx it. He came and sat on the low stool beside the chair, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and he looked at his daughter's face with the expression of a man who has learned, slowly and at some cost, that it is possible to love something without the love being poisoned by the fear of losing it. He hadn't fully learned it. She knew he hadn't. It was the project of years, not months. But he was getting there. Go back to sleep, Elena said. I've got her. I'm awake now. You're going to be useless tomorrow. I'm already useless tomorrow, he said. Might as well be awake for something worthwhile. They sat in the kitchen while the cold night went on outside, the 3 of them in the lamp's small circle of light, and the ranch was quiet around them, and the creek was doing its low and patient thing in the dark. And Elena sat with her daughter and her husband in a house that was hers, on land that was hers, in a life that she had chosen piece by piece out of the materials available to her, which had not been much, and had built into this, not perfect. She would have said that to anyone who asked. It was not a perfect life. It was a complicated and demanding and sometimes frustrating life with broken latches and difficult winters, and a baby who had strong views about blankets, and a man who watched her too carefully sometimes, and a sister-in-law who expressed love through volume and quantity of baked goods. But it was real. Every corner of it was real, and it was hers, and she had made it. The woman they had sent away came back to no one. She had not gone back. She had simply become someone that a going back was no longer possible for, because you cannot return to a place smaller than the one you currently occupy, and she had, quietly and deliberately and without anyone's permission, grown too large for the life they'd tried to keep her in. That was all. That was everything. Outside, the stars were the particular dense and brilliant kind that only appear when the air is very cold and very clear, the kind that look, on a night like this, like they've been there forever and intend to stay. Ruth slept. The fire held, and Elena, who had once sat in the dark deciding to survive, sat now in the light she had made and found it enough. Found it. Against all the reasonable predictions of her early life, more than enough.